Trump just renamed the Strait of Hormuz, and oil markets panicked. How a renamed waterway revealed the emerging geometry of power in the energy age. What if the most important oil corridor on Earth just changed its name, not officially, strategically? When Donald Trump called the Strait of Hormuz the Strait of Trump, markets didn't laugh. Oil jumped above $126, shipping slowed, and government started paying attention, because this wasn't a joke, it was a warning. Late in April, as oil surged beyond $126 a barrel and tanker traffic through the world's most sensitive maritime choke point slowed to a trickle, America's president posted an altered map online. The label Strait of Hormuz had been replaced with something else, the Strait of Trump. It looked like a joke, the sort of theatrical flourish that has become routine in the rhetorical repertoire of Donald Trump. Markets, however, did not laugh. Nor did policymakers in Tehran, Riyadh, Beijing, or Brussels. The image was not geography. It was signaling. And like most signals in modern geopolitics, it said more than it appeared to say. The renaming of Hormuz did not change shipping routes. It did not alter treaty law. It did not move a single destroyer or tanker. Yet it revealed something deeper about how Washington increasingly sees the world, not as a stable network of rules and institutions, but as a map of corridors, choke points, and leverage points through which power flows. Control the corridors and one controls the system. The Strait of Hormuz is the most important corridor of them all. And the message embedded in its temporary renaming was unmistakable. Access to the artery of global energy still runs through American strategy, geography as leverage in an age of fragmentation. In the decades after the Cold War, maritime security looked like background infrastructure. Tankers moved. Insurance markets functioned. Pipelines extended quietly beneath deserts and seabeds. Oil prices fluctuated, but the physical architecture of global supply rarely appeared in headlines unless something exploded. That era is ending. The war in Ukraine, disruptions in the Red Sea. Tensions in the South China Sea and renewed rivalry between major powers have transformed supply routes into instruments of competition. Shipping lanes are no longer neutral. They are strategic terrain. Pipelines are no longer engineering projects. They are geopolitical alignments in steel form. Within that emerging map, the Strait of Hormuz occupies a singular position. 1/5 of the world's traded crude normally passes through the narrow corridor linking the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean. Interrupt that flow and industrial economies across Asia feel the shock within days. European refineries follow soon after. Even markets nominally insulated from Gulf supply react instantly through expectations and speculation. This is why even partial disruption produces disproportionate consequences. A reduction in transit to a fraction of normal volume signals not merely logistical congestion but strategic intervention. Markets respond to uncertainty faster than diplomats respond to crises. The price spike above $126 a barrel therefore reflected something more than scarcity. It reflected anticipation. Traders were pricing the possibility that Hormuz itself had become negotiable territory. The rhetoric of renaming as strategy. Presidents rarely rename international waterways. When they do, it usually marks a war or a revolution. Yet Donald Trump has long used language not as description but as pressure. Naming becomes positioning. Labels become leverage. Previous examples followed a similar logic. The branding of adversaries in economic conflicts, the rhetorical framing of diplomatic agreements as personal achievements, and the transformation of sanctions campaigns into sloganized doctrines all turned communication into coercion. The effect was cumulative. Words became instruments of negotiation rather than commentary. Seen in this context, calling Hormuz the Strait of Trump was less a joke than a declaration. It implied that the corridor's functioning depended less on geography than on naval dominance, and that naval dominance remained American. The intended audience extended far beyond Iran. Tehran heard a warning. Gulf monarchies heard reassurance. China heard something closer to a structural reminder about the vulnerability of its energy supply lines. Renaming the strait did not change its coordinates. It changed its meaning. Hormuz, and the architecture of maritime power, the global energy system rests not only on reserves but on routes. Pipelines, ports, and shipping corridors form the skeleton of industrial civilization. Control those routes and one acquires influence disproportionate to territorial size. For decades, the United States has quietly guaranteed access to those corridors. Its naval presence in the Persian Gulf ensured tanker traffic through Hormuz. Its patrols in East Asia stabilized transit through the South China Sea. Its alliances extended insurance coverage in geopolitical form across the world's shipping lanes. This arrangement functioned as a public good. It reduced transaction costs. It lowered insurance premiums. It stabilized expectations, but public goods can become bargaining tools. As rivalry between major powers intensifies, maritime security is being reinterpreted not as a universal service but as a conditional guarantee. Access to corridors increasingly depends on alignment with the power that protects them. The signal embedded in the renaming of Hormuz suggested precisely such a shift. The corridor was no longer merely open. It was open under supervision. Oil markets as instruments of diplomacy. Energy prices do not simply reflect supply and demand. They also encode geopolitical expectations. When prices rise sharply in response to disruption near Hormuz, markets are not only calculating missing barrels. They are calculating risk trajectories. The surge beyond $126 a barrel signaled that traders expected instability to persist rather than dissipate. That expectation itself becomes strategic leverage. Importers scramble to diversify supply. Exporters adjust fiscal plans. Central banks recalibrate inflation forecasts. Governments reconsider alliances. In this environment, oil ceases to be merely a commodity. It becomes a diplomatic variable. For the United States, the timing is favorable. Domestic production has reduced its structural dependence on Gulf supply. Europe remains exposed but diversified. Asia, by contrast, remains deeply reliant on maritime imports from the region. Any disruption at Hormuz therefore redistributes economic vulnerability eastward. That redistribution carries geopolitical implications. It alters bargaining power without firing a shot. Iran's dilemma at the choke point. For Tehran, the Strait of Hormuz has always been both shield and sword. Threatening closure provides leverage. Attempting closure risks catastrophe. Iran possesses the capacity to harass shipping, deploy mines and mobilize proxy forces across the region. It does not possess the capacity to sustain a prolonged denial campaign against American naval power. This asymmetry creates a familiar pattern: escalation without closure. Iranian strategy has long relied on ambiguity. Signals are issued through exercises, missile tests, and proxy operations. Shipping lanes become tense but rarely blocked. The objective is uncertainty rather than interruption. Recent American signaling threatens to alter that equilibrium. Reports of potential port blockades, combined with symbolic gestures emphasizing control of Hormuz, narrow Tehran's room for maneuver. If exports decline further, domestic pressure increases. If retaliation escalates, military risk rises. The result is strategic compression, fewer acceptable choices, each carrying higher costs, proxy networks, and the logic of indirect response. Iran rarely responds directly when confronted by superior conventional force. Instead, it activates networks of influence stretching from Lebanon to Yemen. Hezbollah, militia groups in Iraq and the Houthis in the Red Sea form part of an architecture designed to distribute pressure across multiple theaters simultaneously. Such networks allow Tehran to retaliate without triggering full-scale war. Shipping disruptions in one corridor can answer enforcement in another. Missile strikes in peripheral arenas can signal resolve without inviting decisive retaliation. Yet proxy escalation has limits. It increases instability without guaranteeing leverage. It also risks drawing additional actors into the conflict environment. If American pressure around Hormuz intensifies, Tehran's reliance on indirect response mechanisms is likely to increase. But so too is the probability of miscalculation. Gulf monarchies, and the reassurance problem. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have spent the past decade recalibrating their strategic posture. Both have expanded relations with China. Both have explored diplomatic engagement with Iran. Both have pursued oil policies less tightly aligned with Washington's preferences, yet neither can secure maritime corridors independently. American signaling around Hormuz therefore performs a dual function. It pressures Iran while reminding Gulf capitals that tanker security remains dependent on American naval infrastructure. Even theatrical rhetoric can reinforce deterrence when backed by credible force. For Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, the message is familiar: autonomy has limits where shipping lanes begin. In that sense, the renaming of the strait was as much reassurance as provocation. Asia's exposure to maritime vulnerability. The most consequential audience for developments at Hormuz lies thousands of kilometers east of the Persian Gulf. China, India, Japan, and South Korea depend heavily on energy shipments transiting the corridor. Any sustained disruption therefore affects the industrial core of the global economy. China in particular faces structural exposure. Half of its imported crude passes through Hormuz. Combined with its dependence on the Strait of Malacca, this creates a dual choke point vulnerability at opposite ends of its maritime supply chain. Chinese strategists have long recognized this weakness. Efforts to diversify supply routes through Central Asia, Russia and Pakistan reflect attempts to mitigate it. Yet maritime imports remain indispensable. Control of Hormuz therefore translates into indirect influence over China's growth trajectory. That influence does not require blockade. It requires uncertainty, Europe's uneasy return to energy anxiety. For Europe, the shock at Hormuz evokes uncomfortable memories. The continent has spent the past decade attempting to reduce dependence on Russian hydrocarbons. Diversification toward Middle Eastern suppliers formed part of that strategy. Disruption in the Gulf therefore reintroduces vulnerabilities thought to be diminishing. Higher prices also complicate monetary policy. Inflation expectations respond quickly to energy costs. Governments facing fiscal pressure from defense spending and industrial transition programs find themselves squeezed by rising import bills. Thus, a corridor far from European shores quietly shapes debates in Brussels and Berlin alike. Energy security, once again, becomes continental strategy, the transformation of maritime corridors into bargaining tables. The most striking feature of recent developments is not disruption itself but reinterpretation. Shipping lanes are no longer merely transit routes. They are negotiation spaces. Access becomes conditional. Protection becomes political. Insurance becomes strategic. This transformation reflects a broader shift in the structure of global order. The liberal assumption that trade routes exist independently of power is giving way to a realist understanding that routes exist because power sustains them. In such a world, geography becomes diplomacy by other means. Renaming Hormuz fits neatly within this shift. It reframed a physical corridor as a political instrument. It reminded observers that openness is never automatic. It is guaranteed, or withdrawn, by those who control the sea. Markets as early warning systems of geopolitical change. Financial markets often detect shifts in strategic posture before governments acknowledge them. The surge in oil prices following disruption near Hormuz signaled expectations of prolonged instability rather than temporary tension. Insurance premiums for shipping rose. Tanker routes adjusted. Speculative positions shifted. Each movement translated political uncertainty into economic signals. Such signals matter because they shape behavior long before policies change. Companies diversify supply chains. Governments accelerate strategic reserves. Militaries reconsider deployment patterns. In this way, markets function as early warning systems for geopolitical transformation. Symbolism as infrastructure of deterrence. Modern geopolitics increasingly relies on symbolic gestures to shape expectations. Images, statements, and rhetorical framing create psychological terrain on which decisions are made. The photograph of a president holding a rifle before a smoky backdrop, accompanied by language suggesting the end of restraint, belongs to this symbolic infrastructure. It prepares domestic audiences for escalation. It warns adversaries of resolve. It reassures allies of commitment. Renaming Hormuz operates in the same register. It is not a policy. It is preparation for policy. Such gestures rarely stand alone. They usually precede changes in posture, controlled escalation as a strategic method. The emerging pattern around Hormuz resembles a choreography rather than a confrontation. Maritime inspections are tightened. Exports decline. Rhetoric sharpens. Prices are rising. Negotiations stall. Each step alters incentives without triggering full-scale conflict. This method allows pressure to accumulate gradually. It increases leverage while preserving flexibility. It signals seriousness without eliminating diplomatic options. Historically, such strategies have produced mixed results. They can compel concessions. They can also entrench resistance. Much depends on the domestic resilience of the targeted state. In Iran's case, resilience has often proved greater than expected. The corridor at the center of a changing order. The renaming of Hormuz did not alter maps. It altered perceptions. And perceptions shape strategy as surely as fleets do. In an era defined by competition over supply chains, logistics corridors, and resource transit routes, control of choke points carries renewed significance. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of that geography. Whoever governs access to it influences not only energy markets but diplomatic alignments across continents. By transforming the corridor into a personal symbol of American authority, Washington signaled that maritime infrastructure remains an instrument of statecraft rather than a neutral backdrop to trade. The strait itself has not moved, but the politics surrounding it have shifted decisively. And in geopolitics, shifts in meaning often precede shifts in power.